Today we're talking about the sneaky Space Marines, who somehow managed to run covert ops while dressed in bright blue power armor. Today we're talking Infiltrators and Incursors. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're taking a look at the Phobos armoured Space Marine troops and talking about what they can achieve in game. When they first came out, I'd described the Infiltrators and Incursors as kind of okay but a bit expensive compared with other options, particularly when we had scouts available in the trooper slot. Now that's no longer the case, they've really come into their own, and I'd argue that these two are just both really competitive Space Marine units and a fairly easy include for competitive Marine lists. In the video we'll take a look at both their datasheets, talk about any buffs and synergy for the units, and how I think about using them in game. So first up, let's talk about the Primaris Infiltrator Squad. They're a trooper's choice for Codex Space Marines at 24 points per model, and they have pretty much the standard Primaris Space Marine stat line. In terms of war gear, compared with Intercessors, they trade out their bolt rifle for a marksman bolt carbine, which essentially has the profile of a standard bolter, 24 inches, rapid fire 1, strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1, but each time you make an unmodified hit roll of a 6, it automatically wounds the targets. Now, auto-wounding is nice and everything, it certainly gives them a little bit more bite against high-toughness targets, but still, point for damage output, they still don't compare with the standard Intercessor squad. They get extra range, extra shots or extra AP, and they do cost 4 points less, so to be honest I wouldn't get too worked up about the Infiltrator's damage output. The extra free wounds that you get just kind of make up from them being a little bit more expensive in the first place. Aside from trading out the guns, the other advantages that the Infiltrators get are concealed positions, the ability to set up in the midfield, which is just so useful for missions. It means you can take control of the centre of the board before the game has even begun, and hopefully screen out your opponent from doing the same. We'll talk a little bit more on its uses in a bit. Other than this, the other advantages that they get are the Omni Scrambler. This is the reason that I think that Infiltrators pay a premium above Incursors. The Omni Scramblers give them a 12-inch exclusion range where enemy reinforcements can't set up within. It's honestly really quite a powerful rule, as lots of enemy reinforcements really want to be setting up within 12 inches, either to try and get in a charge on you, or shoot you with weapons that have a 12-inch range, things like many variants of bolter or maybe overcharged plasma or something. It means that a couple of units of these strung out could deny a vast amount of deep strike space to your opponent, and if you've got a bunch of other Space Marine units screening behind them, you might be forcing them back into their own deployment zone. Finally, in terms of keywords, they have a couple of extra useful ones over standard Intercessors. They have the Phobos and Smokescreen keywords, both of which allow them some additional stratagems and synergy options, as we'll mention in a second. Finally, one Primaris Infiltrator can either take a Helix Gauntlet or an Infiltrator Comms Array, both of which can be kind of useful. The Helix Gauntlet allows your first failed saving throw of the turn to count as damage 0, and that can potentially save an Infiltrator's life if they are being hit with a heavy weapon. In general, it's actually quite a nice and fairly efficient durability upgrade. I used to not be the biggest fan of it, but I think it's reasonable to take or leave if you want. If you take it, then the models in your squad will be just that little bit tougher, but I don't think it's really essential for the squad getting done what it needs to get done, so it is very much an optional extra. The other option is the Infiltrator Comms Array, which is 5 points. This allows them to always be in range of the rights of battle and tactical precision abilities of the Phobos Captain and Lieutenant if you have them in your list. As Infiltrators tend to operate quite independently, this could be handy if you already have those characters about. Though to be honest, I think in more competitive lists, I don't think you're really going to be wanting to spend all the points on the Phobos Captain and Lieutenant compared with other HQ options, and then pay yet more points with this upgrade to allow them to be in range. I'd say that this one's typically not one that's going to be taken unless you are deliberately going down a very Phobos heavy strategy, maybe deliberately running multiple units of Infiltrators and those characters to make the rerolls actually worth it. If you've only got one Phobos Captain, it's not the worst upgrade in the world, but it's not the most meaningful buff either. If we compare them to the Incursor unit now, Incursors are a bit cheaper at 21 points per model, and they have the exact same Primaris stat line, but trade out their war gear for a few different options. Instead of that auto wounds on 6's ability, their Oculus bolt carbines are the same bolter profile, but enemy units don't receive the benefit of cover against them, and they also ignore any modifiers to ballistic skill, so they're pretty much ideal tools of choice if you're trying to shift something like Eldar Rangers for example. Both rules could certainly come up fairly regularly, though maybe not quite as reliable a boost in damage output as the Infiltrators get. The Incursors also get paired combat blades, which are pretty handy and make all of their melee attacks AP-1, so they're just that bit more of a combat threat than the Infiltrators are. But the main trade-off is that you don't get the Omni Scrambler bubble for denying deep strike, which those Infiltrators do pay a premium for. Otherwise they're fairly similar, they are Phobos units with a smokescreen keyword, and they also have concealed positions. and I think both these guys and the Infiltrators are very viable to include in a Space Marine army. You basically just have to pick the advantages you want. It's really that really nice deep strike denial versus extra melee AP and being cheaper to field for the unit. In addition, the Incursors also have the option of taking a Haywire Mine should you want to. This one's changed quite a bit on the previous edition. It's 10 points and it essentially gives you some mortal wounds when the opponent tries to charge you. When an enemy unit successfully charges your unit, roll a d6 and on a 2+, the enemy unit suffers d3 mortal wounds, or if it has the vehicle keyword, it suffers 3 instead. For me, I'd say it's probably not the most competitive pick. I think it's going to be rare that you'll actually save the unit from being killed in close combat by using a Haywire Mine. And there's some games that you might not even get charged at all, and the opponent just shoots you down with guns. But if you do have a few points kicking around when you finish writing a list, I don't think it's the worst investment for something that will do something fun every couple of games. So let's talk about the buffs and synergy that we can use for Infiltrators and Incursors then. First of all, I'd say that chapter choice isn't all that much important for them. Most are useful in one way or another, but really I'd be more thinking what the Infiltrators and Incursors can add to the army as to what the chapter tactic can add to them. For chapter tactics though, one of my favourites is actually that Iron Hands feel no pain for these guys. Their main duty is just to not to die on objectives or hold the enemy back for as long as possible, so being a little bit tougher is no bad thing. All the rest of the chapters do have their advantages from their own tactics, but ones I particularly quite like are Blood Angels Incursors. Having +1 to wound with their attacks makes them a legitimate melee threat, and White Scars can be quite interesting as well, as you can pull off some really long charges with their advance and charge maneuvers. In terms of character support, typically I would say that they want to be operating independently, so most of the time I wouldn't bother to buy them any. If it's convenient though, and they happen to be near any captains or lieutenants for rerolls, then by all means they can do a little bit of extra damage. There are also a fair few specific Phobos buffs that they can use, such as the Obscuration Discipline. It can allow you to do some fancy tricks, such as Shrouding to prevent them being targeted by anything that's closer, Soul Sight to make them a bit more accurate, and Temporal Corridor to get them a double move to cover a lot of ground very quickly. In all honesty, these powers are quite good, but I'm just not sure they're really worth the investment to buy the Phobos Librarian and then have him use them on the unit, compared with just having more units. I feel like each of these buffs could be a lot more interesting on non-Phobos units, to be honest. Most of the time I think they're going to be starting quite far forward, so Shrouding isn't going to be all that relevant. Soul Sight is a decent damage buff, but isn't really needed on a unit that's got very low damage output point for point. And Temporal Corridor is one of the ones that interests me the most, but stops you from having any damage output, and you might just be better off moving and doing a nuisance charge anyway. The Vanguard Warlord traits also have a couple of interesting options. In particular, Shoot and Phase can be quite a powerful one, to allow a nearby Phobos unit to shoot and then move again as if it were the movement phase. That means you could either have Jump, Shoot, Jump Infiltrators or Incursors, or you could just make them very, very fast in themselves, because they could move 6 inches forward, shoot, and then also move another 6 inches forward, maybe to get onto an objective. Lord of Deceit is the other quite good one. This one's your standard redeploy before the game begins stratagem, and can be pretty handy for countering where the enemy sets up. Finally, while they are infantry and can technically go in transports if they need to, typically I'd not bother. A lot of the value in these guys are their forward deployment options, so there's not really much sense in putting them in something like an Impulsor, when you could have a more threatening unit like Intercessors or Blade Guard Veterans in there. I think they're just likely to be better use of that transport capacity. Next we come on to Stratagems, and again, seeing as I see these guys' main job as getting onto objectives and surviving there, my favourite two are Transhuman Physiology and Smokescreen. Transhuman is 1 command point if you've only got 5 models in the unit, and will make them very hard to wound, and Smokescreen is a nice reactive -1 to hit, and it could actually be really relevant if you're facing a ballistic skills 4 army, such as Imperial Guard. Finally, the other stratagem that I think is potentially really quite powerful on these guys is Guerrilla Tactics. That's a 1 command point 1 to allow the squad to be put into strategic reserves when it started on the table. Maybe could give you some outflanking shenanigans in the last turn or two. Perhaps could be quite relevant for getting onto table quarters, doing an action like deploying scramblers, or maybe even trying to charge an enemy unit on their home objective where they thought they were safe. Otherwise, there are a few potential others that they might want to use: Gene-wrought Might for a bit of extra combat might, Auspex Scan to try and gun down some reserves, Uncompromising Fire if you absolutely have to have their shooting while they're doing an action, and Steady Advance to shoot as if they were stationary. For me, all of these are really quite low yield, to be honest, just because their damage output isn't so stellar, and I'd only really consider using it if you had a full squad of 10, rather than running them in multiple small units. So how would I think about running Incursors or Infiltrators in-game then? I'll start out by saying that I'd be absolutely happy to run either unit. I think that both of them are very competitive, and actually really quite balanced in Warhammer 40k right now. The main decision I'd make is whether you want to pay the extra points for that 12-inch deep strike denial bubble the Infiltrators have, and then pick one or the other from there. Typically I would run them in units of 5 and not more. small units to avoid any extra damage from the blast keyword, and there might be some of your grunts doing actions and things, so it's not necessary to overinvest. When using the units, I would typically think of their damage output as a bit of a bonus. It's generally a bit mediocre, and they're only really going to be anywhere near efficient against enemy light infantry. It'll certainly be helpful to put out a few bolt shots each turn, but they're not likely to actually make any significant change to the course of the game. And if it comes to a decision between either keeping them safe or getting them into the right position or getting their maximum damage, then I'd choose the positioning or safety. The main way I think they fit into a Space Marine list is being a nice OBSEC tough unit that can start far forwards and threaten the enemy lines. Generally, I think you'll be wanting to make use of their concealed positions, starting up somewhere in the midfield, either where they can be on objectives or move onto them. If the opponent has similar units such as their own Infiltrators, or maybe things like Nurglings, it might be worth dropping them fairly early in the deployment sequence to make sure that your opponent can't place those same units there. When you're putting things far forward, they are likely to be quite exposed. You can either go one of two ways, either be quite gutsy and think about doing a first turn charge or really disrupting the enemy forces, or try and be a bit more conservative and put them somewhere to be in a bit more cover, and try and make sure that they don't just straight up die if you go second. If you're using Infiltrators and you're facing a deep strike heavy army, then with a bit of careful positioning, you might actually be able to make it so virtually no enemy unit can deep strike anywhere within 9 inches of your army. I just try and chain out the units behind you so you cover as much of your deployment zone as possible. It can be really relevant and powerful against certain armies such as Orcs, who will quite likely be using Dajump to get across the board and get their boys into your lines. If it isn't such an issue though, and you're not wanting to try and protect your entire army, you could even think about using your Infiltrators to hold a backfield objective and allowing the rest of your army just to charge on up ahead. They're a very, very good way of keeping one objective super safe, as because your opponent can't bring in reinforcements within 12 inches of them, they're never going to be able to charge them out of deep strike, and that objective should be safe unless they've got some very fast movers. Incursors, on the other hand, their main advantage of screening things out is that things are likely going to be hitting them rather than your more valuable units behind the lines, and of course being cheaper, they're not quite as much of a big deal if you lose them quite early. Those blades are pretty nice as well, so getting some early charges off on light infantry could actually be fairly powerful in whittling down the foe's numbers. In any case, I think that both of these sneaky Phobos units are really quite powerful assets to the Space Marine army. Having solid competitive units that can start in the midfield is just so powerful, and now that scouts have been shunted to elites rather than troops, they've pretty much taken over the scout role, to the extent where it's actually fairly rare to see a competitive Space Marine list that doesn't feature one or more of these units. Particularly now, Incursors are just 1 point more than Intercessors, having that forward deployment option is just so nice, and it's something that a lot of people seem to go for rather than the slightly higher damage output of the Intercessors. So as always, let me know your impressions of the Phobos units in 9th edition. I'll be interested to hear if they've been performing well for you and keeping your objectives safe. Please let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or we'll certainly be keeping the 40k content coming out pretty much every day. And if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which is what allows me to dedicate quite so much time to making videos about model soldiers. Channel patrons do get a few other perks, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.